The suitcase was already zipped shut before I finished my sentence. I was 10 years old, standing in the doorway of my parents' bedroom with the speech I'd rehearsed in the bathroom mirror for 3 days, and my mother didn't even let me get to the part where I promised to be good on the car ride. She just reached over, pulled the zipper closed on the little blue suitcase sitting on the bed, and said, "Aunt Linda's expecting you Thursday, sweetheart." Like I'd asked her what time dinner was instead of whether I could please come to Yellowstone with the rest of my family. That's the moment I want you to picture first. Not because it's the worst thing that ever happened to me, it isn't. Not even close. But because it's the moment that taught me everything I needed to know about where I stood in my own family. I was already packed before I opened my mouth. That's not a metaphor. That's just what happened. My name is Myra Sellers. I'm 29 now, and I own a bakery on the shore of Lake Coeur d'Alene in Idaho, and most days I'm happy, genuinely happy, in a way I didn't think was available to people like me when I was that 10-year-old girl in the doorway. But to understand how I got here, you have to go back further than that suitcase. You have to go back to when I was 2 years old and my brother Danny was 6, and the doctors told my parents a word that turned our whole family into a different shape and never let it turn back. Danny was diagnosed with leukemia in the fall of 1999. I don't remember any of it firsthand. I was a toddler. I have no memories from that period at all. Just the mythology of it that got told and retold at every family gathering for the rest of my childhood, the way some families tell the story of how the parents met. Except this story didn't have a cute ending where two strangers fall in love at a coffee shop. This story had 4 years of chemotherapy, hospital stays that swallowed whole seasons, a kid who lost his hair twice and his appetite more times than anyone could count, and 2 parents, my mother Carol and my father Walter, who aged about 15 years in the space of 4. Danny went into remission in the spring of 2003, when I was 6 and he was 10. And I want to be very clear about something, because I know exactly what you might be thinking right now, and I need you to sit with the complicated truth of it, rather than the easy version. What happened to Danny was genuinely terrifying. He nearly died. My parents nearly lost their son. Nobody in this story is a villain for being changed by that. If my mother had walked out of those 4 years a little broken, a little overprotective, flinching every time Danny got a cold, I'd understand that completely. I'd have grace for that forever. But that's not what happened. What happened is that my parents didn't come out of Danny's illness changed. They came out of it reorganized. Permanently. Like the remission wasn't an ending, it was a renovation, and the blueprint they drew up afterward had exactly 2 people in the load-bearing walls. And I wasn't one of them. The family mission, from the time I was old enough to understand what a family mission even was, became making memories with Danny. I heard that phrase, making memories with Danny, so many times growing up that it stopped sounding like words and started sounding like weather, something that just happened around me, that I had no power to change or question, like rain. And I became the other thing, the healthy one, the easy one. The kid who, according to the family script that got written sometime around 2003 and never revised, didn't need anything. I want you to understand how insidious that phrase is, because on the surface it sounds like a compliment. Myra doesn't need anything. Doesn't that sound like praise? Like you raised a low-maintenance, resilient, well-adjusted kid? But what it actually meant, in practice, in my house, was that whatever I did need got quietly reclassified as something I could live without. My needs weren't absent. They were just permanently deprioritized in favor of somebody else's, and then everyone agreed to call that deprioritization a personality trait of mine, like I'd asked for it. The family motto, and yes, we actually had one, said out loud, usually by my mother, Dad usually with a hand on my shoulder that was meant to feel warm, and instead felt like a door closing, was, "Strong kids don't make a fuss." I heard that so many times I could say it in my sleep. I probably did say it in my sleep. Strong kids don't make a fuss. Which meant, if you fuss, you're not strong. Which meant, the only way to keep being loved in this house is to want less than everyone else and mention it even less than that. So starting the summer I turned 8, this would have been June of 2005. My parents began a tradition that would define the next 9 summers of my life. Every June, like clockwork, they packed me a suitcase and drove me 3 hours to my Aunt Linda's house in Torch Bay, Michigan, a little lake town up near the tip of the mitt. So quiet and slow-moving it felt like the whole place existed in a different decade. And then they took Danny on a family vacation. Just the three of them. Orlando one year. Yellowstone another. The Grand Canyon. San Diego. Niagara Falls. I could list you all 9 destinations across those 9 summers, and I bet I'd get every single one right, because I spent a lot of years memorizing the geography of trips I wasn't invited on. And every summer, without fail, a postcard would arrive at Aunt Linda's house addressed to me. My mother's handwriting, always the same cheerful, looping cursive, always the same 4 words. Wish you were here. I want to sit with that phrase for a second, because I think it's the detail that made grown adults tear up when I finally told this whole story out loud, years later, to people who actually loved me. Wish you were here. 4 words. A phrase you'd write to a coworker from a beach vacation. A phrase that costs nothing and means nothing and takes maybe 4 seconds to write on the back of a postcard between buying sunscreen and reapplying it. My mother wrote those words to her 8-year-old daughter, and then her 9-year-old daughter, and then her 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old daughter, for 9 consecutive summers, from 9 different vacations she had chosen not to bring that daughter on. Wish you were here. If you wished I was there, Mom, I used to think, lying on the pull-out couch in Aunt Linda's guest room with the postcard on the nightstand. You had my phone number. You had a car. You had a spare seat. Every single year, in every single vehicle, on every single trip. Wishing costs nothing. You could have just brought me. But I never said that to her. Because strong kids don't make a fuss. Here's the thing that I think surprises people most when I tell this story, though. And it's important, because it's the reason I didn't fall apart during those years. The reason I'm sitting here at 29 able to tell you this with something like humor in my voice instead of just grief. Torch Bay wasn't a punishment. Aunt Linda made sure of that. Let me introduce you to her properly, because she deserves it. Linda Kowalski was my mother's older sister by 6 years, which put her in her mid-40s when I first started coming to stay with her. A stocky, sunburned, big-laughing woman who ran a little lakeside bakery out of a building that used to be her late husband Frank's hardware store. She'd never had kids of her own. There'd been some medical reason nobody ever explained to me in detail, and I never asked, because even as a kid I understood some doors you don't push on, and I think that's part of why she poured so much of herself into the 6 or 7 weeks a year she got with me. Linda taught me to bake before she taught me almost anything else, which tells you something about her priorities, and I mean that as the highest compliment. By the time I was 9, I could make a decent pie crust from memory. By 11, I understood the difference between folding and stirring, why you don't overwork dough, why you let butter come to room temperature instead of microwaving it like an animal. She gave me real jobs in the bakery, not busy work. By 12, I was running the register during the slow midweek hours, making change, learning to talk to customers like a person instead of a kid being tolerated. She paid me for it too, actual money, cash in an envelope every Friday, and she'd look me dead in the eye when she handed it over and say, "You earned that, Myra. Don't let anybody tell you different." I think about that sentence a lot. You earned that. Don't let anybody tell you different. Linda was building something into me that summer after summer, brick by brick, without ever making a speech about it. She was teaching me that I was a person whose contributions counted, whose presence mattered, whose work had value, all the things my parents' house had quietly stopped telling me the year Danny got sick. When I was 12, Linda did something that I didn't fully understand the weight of until I was much older. She called my mother and offered to take me for the whole school year. Not just the summer, the whole year. She had room. She had, by then, hired help at the bakery so she wasn't stretched too thin. She told my mother it would be good for me to have some stability, some consistency, a place where I wasn't the summer arrangement but just home. My mother said no. I found out the reason years later, from Linda herself. Sitting at her kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. And it is, to this day, one of the sentences that has stayed lodged in my chest, like a piece of glass I can feel, but can't quite dig out. She said that's not how it would look, Linda told me. Sending you away for a whole school year. She said people would ask questions. Not I'd miss her too much. Not I want her here. Not even I'm not ready. That's not how it would look. My mother turned down a genuinely loving offer from her own sister, an offer that would have given me stability and a real home base and a full-time version of the only unconditional adult attention I was getting because of optics. Because summers away could be explained as a nice tradition, a fun arrangement, but a kid living with her aunt for the school year might make the neighbors wonder what was wrong in the Sellers house. Nothing was wrong in the Sellers house as far as the neighbors were concerned. Nothing was ever allowed to look wrong. That was, I'd eventually understand, the whole operating system of my childhood. I tried once to change the arrangement. I was 10, the summer of the suitcase I told you about at the start. We were supposed to be going to Yellowstone that year, and I'd overheard my parents talking about the itinerary at dinner, and something in me, some last flicker of a kid who still thought this was a solvable problem, decided I would make my case. I planned it out. I practiced in the bathroom mirror. I was going to tell them I'd be no trouble. I'd sit quietly in the car. I wouldn't ask for souvenirs. I just wanted to see the geysers, too. I never got past, "Mom, can I ask you something?" because she'd already zipped the suitcase. That's not a coincidence I'm dramatizing for effect. That's the literal, actual sequence of events. I walked into their room to make my case, and my suitcase, already packed for Torch Bay, was sitting there finished, done, zipped, before I said a single word of my speech. Which meant the decision had never been a decision at all. It had been made in advance every single year without me in the room, and my asking was never going to be a conversation. It was going to be a formality I performed for an audience that had already left. I never asked again after that. Not because I stopped wanting to go. I wanted to go every single year, right up until I was probably 15 or 16 and had made a kind of internal peace with Torch Bay that I'll get to. But because I understood, with the clarity that only humiliation gives a kid, that asking wasn't a door. It was a wall with a picture of a door painted on it. So my teenage years took a different shape. I stopped trying to get invited into my family's life and started quietly building one of my own. I got a job at 15, bussing tables and eventually waitressing at a diner called the Wagon Wheel, a couple of towns over from where we lived in Ohio. A job my parents approved of mostly because it meant I was keeping busy during the school year and not underfoot during the parts of summer they were home. I was good at it. I was fast, I was polite, I remembered regulars' orders, and I made decent tips, and every single dollar of those tips went into a coffee can in the back of my closet, and then eventually into an actual savings account. I opened myself at 16, which my mother co-signed without asking a single question about why a 16-year-old wanted a savings account instead of spending her tip money on clothes like a normal kid. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters for you to really understand who I was during those years, not just what was done to me. I wasn't plotting some dramatic escape from the beginning. It didn't feel like a heist. It felt like survival. The way you learn to walk a certain way on ice without really deciding to, your body just adjusts. I was quietly, patiently, over years, building the version of a life that nobody could zip a suitcase shut on without asking me first. By the time I was 16 or 17, I'd started actually researching towns. I didn't tell anyone this, not even Linda, not at first. I'd sit in the wagon wheel during slow shifts and use my phone to look up small towns that reminded me of Torch Bay lake towns, tourist-adjacent but not overwhelmed. Places small enough that a bakery could be a real fixture of the community instead of getting swallowed by competition. I was looking, without fully admitting it to myself, for a grown-up version of the only place I'd ever felt like I mattered. That's how I landed on Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a lake town in the Panhandle, mountains on one side, water on the other, far enough from Ohio that it might as well have been a different country. I picked it partly because of the lake, and partly, I'll admit, because it was about as far from my parents' house as I could get while staying in the continental United States, without it looking, on paper, like I was trying to disappear off the face of the earth. Which, to be fair, I kind of was. I graduated high school in June of 2015. I was 18 years old. Here's how that day actually went, and I want to tell it to you slowly, because I think the pacing of it says more than any adjective I could use. My graduation ceremony was at 11 in the morning. My parents came. I'll give them that. They showed up, sat in the bleachers, took pictures when I crossed the stage. Danny was 22 by then, out of college, working his first real job at a marketing firm back in Columbus. And he'd flown in for the ceremony too, which felt, in the moment, like a genuine gesture. And then, immediately after the ceremony, before I'd even changed out of my cap and gown, my mother pulled me aside and told me they had to leave. Not, we have to leave soon. Not, let's grab a quick lunch first. We have to leave. Because Danny had a work dinner that evening back in Columbus. Some quarterly thing with his new firm. Some networking dinner his boss was hosting, and my parents didn't want him driving back alone. And the drive was 3 hours. And if they left now, they could make it in time to freshen up first. They left my graduation, the day I finished 12 years of school, to make sure my 22-year-old brother wasn't late for a work dinner. I stood in the parking lot in my cap and gown, holding a bouquet of grocery store carnations my Aunt Linda had actually driven 3 hours to bring me. She was the only person who stayed, who took me out for ice cream afterward, who sat across the table from me in her Torch Bay Bakery apron she'd forgotten to take off and said, "I am so, so proud of you, kid." And I watched my parents' car pull out of the lot before I'd even finished eating my ice cream. I didn't cry. I want you to know that. I know exactly what you're expecting me to say here. And I know exactly what you're picturing. Some big, sobbing collapse in a Baskin-Robbins parking lot. And that's not what happened. What happened is that I felt something settle in me, quiet and cold and completely clear. Like a decision that had actually been made 9 years earlier, finally getting its official paperwork signed. I hugged Linda goodbye that afternoon. She had to get back for the bakery and told her I loved her, and she had no idea, none at all, that it was the last time she'd see me for 4 years. That night, I packed the blue suitcase, the same one. The one that had been zipped shut without my permission when I was 10 years old was now, at 18, mine to pack on my own terms, and there is a kind of poetry in that I didn't even notice until I was much older and telling the story to someone who pointed it out to me. I also packed 9 postcards. I'd taken them, one by one, over the years, from the drawer in Linda's guest room where she kept them for me because I always left them behind at the end of each summer, not wanting to explain to my parents why I still had them. 9 postcards, 9 summers, 9 times. Wish you were here in my mother's cheerful cursive, and underneath each one in pen, small enough that you'd have to know to look for it. I'd started writing my own notes on the back starting around age 12, little true things about what that particular summer had actually been like. The real version. The one nobody in Orlando or Yellowstone or San Diego ever heard. I left a note on the kitchen table. Short. I'd written and rewritten it in my head for probably 2 years by that point, and when the moment finally came, it only needed to be 4 sentences. I'm safe. I'm an adult. I need to build my own life somewhere I'm not the arrangement. Please don't look for me. I got in my car, a used Corolla I'd bought myself with diner money the year before, and I drove west. I was 18 years old, and I had about $4,000 to my name, and I had never in my life felt as light as I did somewhere around the Indiana-Illinois border with the sun coming up behind me. I know exactly what you might be thinking right now. That's a brutal thing to do to your parents. Leaving in the night, no goodbye, no forwarding address, nothing. And I've made peace with the fact that some people will hear this story and land there, and I'm not going to argue you out of it, because I understand the instinct. But I want you to remember the suitcase that zipped itself shut before I finished a sentence. I want you to remember 9 years of wish you were here from people who had a spare seat in the car every single time. I didn't leave a family. I left an arrangement that had been calling itself a family for 9 years, and the only difference between the note on the table and every summer before it was that this time, I was the one doing the packing. A couple of weeks after I left, my parents apparently filed a welfare check with the police back in Ohio. I only found this out years later, and the local department confirmed I was an 18-year-old adult who had left voluntarily, was alive and unharmed as far as they could determine, and was not obligated to disclose my location to anyone, including family. That's the law, by the way, and I'm grateful for it in a way I don't think I can fully articulate. An adult is allowed to leave. An adult is allowed to not be found. They would spend 4 years trying to find me anyway. But before I get to that, because that part of the story deserves its own full breath, and I promise you it's coming, I want to tell you what those 4 years actually looked like from my side. Because I didn't spend them hiding in a hole somewhere feeling sorry for myself. I spent them building the exact thing I'd been quietly constructing in my head since I was 15. I drove into Coeur d'Alene with almost no plan beyond the town's name and the fact that it had a lake. I found an extended stay motel on the cheap side of town and started walking into every restaurant and bakery within a mile radius, asking if anyone needed a dishwasher. Not a baker, a dishwasher. I was smart enough at 18 to know you don't walk into a professional kitchen and announce you're skilled. You walk in and ask for the job nobody else wants, and you do it so well and so reliably that eventually somebody notices you're capable of more. That's exactly what happened at a place called the Lakeshore Cafe, a mid-sized breakfast and lunch spot 2 blocks off the water, owned by a woman named Rosa Delgado. Let me tell you about Rosa, because she is, without question, the second most important person in this entire story, right behind Linda, and she deserves a real introduction. Rosa was in her late 50s when I met her, a small, sharp-eyed, and no-nonsense woman who'd bought the Lakeshore Cafe from its previous owner back in the 90s, and had run it more or less single-handedly ever since her husband passed. She didn't do a lot of talking. She did a lot of watching. And what she watched, that first month I worked for her scrubbing pots at 6 in the morning, was a scared, skinny 18-year-old girl who showed up 15 minutes early to every single shift and never once complained about the water temperature or the grease under her nails. About 6 weeks in, one of her line cooks called out sick on a Saturday morning during the summer rush, and Rosa, out of pure necessity, shoved a spatula in my hand and told me to cover the griddle. I'd never worked a griddle in my life, but I'd spent 9 summers learning dough and heat and timing from a woman who ran her own bakery, and something in my hands just knew what to do. Rosa watched me flip pancakes for 4 hours without a single complaint from a customer, and at the end of the shift she sat me down with a cup of coffee and said, "Where did you learn to cook like that?" I told her the truth. Not all of it. I didn't unload my entire childhood on a woman I'd known for 6 weeks, but enough. My aunt. Summers at a bakery in Michigan. I told her I could bake too, actually, probably better than I could cook. Rosa raised an eyebrow, disappeared into the back, and came out with a bag of flour and told me to prove it. I made her a pie crust that afternoon using Linda's method, the one about not overworking the dough, the one about butter at room temperature, the one about patience being the actual secret ingredient nobody wants to hear. Rosa took one bite of the finished pie 2 days later and told me I was wasted on dishes. Within a year, I was her full-time baker. Within 3 years, the Lakeshore Cafe's pastry case had become the thing people actually came in for, word getting around town the way it does in small places. And Rosa, who was starting to think seriously about retirement, who didn't have children of her own to hand the business to, started talking to me about something I genuinely never let myself imagine as a real possibility. Buying the place. Taking it over. She offered me seller financing, meaning I wouldn't need a bank loan I couldn't have qualified for at 21 anyway. I'd pay her back gradually out of the business's own earnings, over years, at a fair price we negotiated between us like the 2 adults we were. I want to pause here and just let that sit for a second, because I think it's easy to breeze past how remarkable it is. A woman who had every reason to be guarded, who'd built something with her own hands over 30 years, looked at a teenager who showed up out of nowhere with no family references and no credit history, and decided to trust her with the thing she'd spent her whole life building. Rosa Delgado saw me the way Linda had seen me. Not as an arrangement. Not as the easy kid who didn't need anything. As someone worth investing in. The whole time this was happening, the dishwashing, the griddle, the pie crust, the slow, unbelievable climb toward actually owning something, I kept up one small, quiet thread back to the life I'd left. Once a year, every year, around the anniversary of when I'd left, I sent Linda a postcard. No return address, no signature beyond a small drawing I'd started doing as a kind of signature of my own, a little cartoon pie. Steam coming off the top in a curl, sitting in a window. That was it. That was the whole message. I knew she'd understand what it meant, because I knew Linda, and I knew that what she needed most wasn't details. She needed to know I was alive. So every year, a postcard with a doodle of a pie showed up in her mailbox from somewhere out west. And I have to imagine she confirmed this to me later, actually, with tears in her eyes that she kept every single one of them in the same drawer where she used to keep mine. For 4 years, that was the whole shape of my life. Work, grow, save. One postcard a year to the one person who'd earned it. And for 4 years, as far as I knew, nobody was looking. Or if they were, they weren't finding anything. Because I'd been careful, new names spelled slightly differently on some early paperwork. No social media under my real name. Cash for almost everything in the beginning. I wasn't paranoid. I was just a person who understood, from 9 years of experience, exactly how much people who claim to want you back will actually do to find you, versus how much they'll do to make it look, from the outside, like they tried. The thing that finally broke my 4 years of quiet was, of all things, a magazine. A regional lifestyle magazine, the kind that covers small-town business owners and local color pieces about lake towns in the Pacific Northwest, ran a profile that summer on young entrepreneurs in North Idaho and the Lakeshore Cafe, under its brand new sign that now read differently than it had for 30 years, made the cut. There was a photo of me in the piece. My actual name? Myra Sellers, 22 years old, new owner of a beloved lakeside cafe. A whole paragraph about how I'd started as a dishwasher and worked my way up to ownership through what the writer called old-fashioned grit and an eye for pastry. I didn't think twice about it at the time. It felt like a nice, small, local thing. I had no idea the magazine had a website, and I had no idea that a distant cousin of mine back in Ohio, someone on my mother's side, a woman named Diane who I barely remembered, and who apparently still followed regional business publications for reasons I will genuinely never understand, happened to stumble across the online version while scrolling one night, recognized my face immediately even 4 years and a haircut later, and picked up the phone to call my mother within the hour. 4 years of searching. And it wasn't a private investigator or a lucky police tip that found me. It was a distant cousin doom-scrolling a small business magazine at 11 at night. I still think about that sometimes. All that effort, if there even was effort, undone by an algorithm. My parents drove 2,000 miles. I found out later, much later from my father, in a moment I'll get to, that they hadn't even discussed it as a family decision. My mother saw the article, packed a bag, told my father to get the car, and by the next morning they were on the road, driving from Ohio to Idaho in one long, brutal, mostly silent haul. The way you drive when you've made a decision emotionally before you've made it logically. I was behind the counter on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, dusting powdered sugar over a tray of scones, when the bell over the door rang and I looked up and saw my mother's face for the first time in 4 years. I want to describe this moment to you exactly as it happened, because I've replayed it in my head more times than almost anything else in my life. And every time I do, the details are the same, sharp and unforgiving as a photograph. My mother, Carol, looked older. Not dramatically, she was in her early 50s by then, but there was a tiredness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there. And I'd never had the vantage point to see it. My father, Walter, stood a half step behind her. And something about the way he held himself was different too. A kind of stiffness in his movements that I didn't yet understand the reason for. Nobody said anything for what felt like a full 10 seconds. The bell over the door was still faintly ringing. A customer at the corner table looked up, sensed something, and went back to her coffee. And then my mother said the first thing she said to me in 4 years, and I need you to really hear this, because I think it tells you almost everything you need to know about the entire relationship in 11 words. "So," she said, looking around at the cafe, at the pastry case, at the sign, at me. "This is what you left your family for. Not I missed you. Not are you okay. Not even how could you do this to us, which at least would have had some raw honesty in it. This is what you left your family for." Said like an accusation. Said like I owed her an accounting of the trade I'd made, as if my entire life, my entire self, needed to be weighed against whatever she'd expected to receive from me and found wanting. I set down the piping bag I was holding. My hands were steady. I remember being surprised by how steady they were. "Yes," I said. "It is." They hadn't come to apologize. I want to be very clear about that, because for a fraction of a second, standing there, some small and stupid part of me, the part that was still 8 years old with a packed suitcase, hoped that maybe this was it. Maybe this was the moment where my mother finally said the thing I'd been waiting 9 summers and 4 years to hear. She didn't say it. She didn't come close to saying it. What she'd actually come to say, it turned out, once we sat down at a back table and Rosa quietly ushered the last customers out and flipped the sign to closed without a word, without me even asking her to, was something else entirely. My father had early onset Parkinson's. He'd been diagnosed the previous winter. The tremor in his hands, which I'd noticed the second they walked in and hadn't yet let myself understand, was the reason. And my mother, having driven 2,000 miles to deliver this news, wasted no time getting to the actual point of the visit. Someone was going to need to come home and help care for him. Danny had a career now, a wife, 2 young kids of his own. He was, in my mother's words, established. He had a whole life built that couldn't just be uprooted. I, on the other hand, according to my mother sitting across from me at a table in the cafe I now owned, was the strong one. I'd always been the strong one. I didn't need anything, remember? I could handle this. I sat there and listened to her ask me, no, not ask, inform me that I needed to give up the life I had spent 4 years building with my own 2 hands, from dishwater and grease and one pie crust that changed everything, in order to come home and be my father's caregiver, because my brother's life mattered more than mine did. Again. Still. The same math, just wearing a different outfit. I know exactly what you're thinking right now, and I promise you, I thought it too. Sitting there. The audacity of it. The absolute breathtaking audacity of driving 2,000 miles not to say sorry, not to ask how I'd survived, not even to ask what my life actually looked like now, but to walk into it and immediately start redistributing the labor of it according to the same broken ledger that had sent me to Michigan every summer for 9 years. I said no. I said it quietly. I didn't yell. I don't think I've ever yelled at my mother in my entire life, actually. And I used to think that was a weakness in me. And now I understand it was armor. I said no, and I said I was sorry about my father's diagnosis, genuinely sorry, because whatever else was true, he was still my father. And Parkinson's is a cruel thing to hand anyone. But I told her that I had a business, a life, an entire self that I had built specifically because the previous version of my life had made it clear I was disposable whenever something more important came along. And I wasn't going to hand that self back over just because it was convenient timing for everyone else again. My mother's face did something I'd never seen it do before. It went very still, and then very cold. And she said, "I don't know who you think you are now." And I remember thinking, with a kind of quiet and almost peaceful clarity, "That's the most honest thing you've said since you walked in the door. Because you're right. You don't know. And that's exactly the point." They left that day without resolving anything. I gave them Linda's number because I knew Linda would want to know they'd found me, and because some part of me still trusted Linda more than I trusted my own instincts about how to handle this. And then, a few weeks later, Linda called me. She told me the whole story, the one I mentioned earlier, about her offer to take me for the school year when I was 12, about my mother turning it down because of how it would look. She told me because she said she'd decided I deserved to know the whole shape of what had been done to me, not just the parts I'd lived through directly. And she told me she was planning to go back to Ohio for Thanksgiving that year, because my mother had called her too, and had apparently already told the extended family that Myra was coming home and finally stepping up to help with her father, before I had agreed to anything at all. That's the moment the story shifts, and I think you can feel it shifting too. Because up until then, this had been a story about absence, about what happened when nobody showed up. And now, it was about to become a story about what happens when I do. Linda and I flew back to Ohio together that November. We booked a motel room instead of staying with anyone on my insistence, Because I wanted a door I could close that nobody else had a key to, literally and otherwise. Linda understood immediately. No explanation needed, which is one of about 400 reasons I love that woman like she hung the moon. Thanksgiving was at my parents' house, the same house I'd grown up in, the same kitchen table where I'd left a 4-sentence note 4 years earlier. The whole extended family was there, my mother's siblings, a scattering of cousins, my father's brother and his wife, and Danny, with his wife Kelly and their 2 young kids, a boy and a girl, 6 and 4. I want to tell you about Danny here, because up until this point in the story, he's been more of a shape than a person, and that's not fair to him. And honestly, it wasn't entirely fair in real life either. Danny didn't ask to get leukemia at 6 years old. Danny didn't build the system that sent me away every summer. My parents built that, and Danny simply grew up inside of it the same way I did. Except his side of the wall had windows, and mine had a suitcase. He wasn't cruel to me growing up. He wasn't the architect of any of it. He was just absent in his own way, mostly oblivious. A kid and then a teenager, and then a young man who'd never had to examine the shape of the family because the shape of the family had always worked in his favor. And it's a very particular kind of privilege not to notice the walls when you've never once had to press against them. We sat down to dinner, and about 20 minutes in, over the mashed potatoes, my mother tapped her wine glass with a fork and stood up. "I want to make an announcement," she said. And something in my stomach went cold, because I absolutely knew, what was coming before she said a single word of it. "Myra has decided to come home. She's going to be helping take care of your father, and we couldn't be more grateful." There it was, public, in front of everyone. A decision I had never made, delivered as an established fact to an entire room of relatives who were now nodding and smiling, and someone, an aunt, I think, actually started to clap. I stood up. I didn't plan this speech the way I'd planned my 10-year-old one in the bathroom mirror. There was no rehearsal. What came out of me came out clean and whole, like it had been sitting fully formed inside me for 19 years waiting for the exact right moment to finally speak. And I think that's because, in a way, it had been. "That's not true," I said. "I haven't decided anything, because nobody asked me. I want to be really clear with everyone in this room, because I think it's important that you all hear this directly from me instead of from an announcement I never agreed to. You could have heard a fork drop. I think one actually did. I told them. All of it. Not with rage, though I had every right to it. I told it the way I'm telling you now, steady and clear, because I'd had 4 years to sit with the truth of my own life, and I wasn't going to let it get flattened into a toast at somebody else's dinner table. I told them about the 9 summers, about the postcards, about the suitcase that zipped itself shut, about my graduation day and the drive back to Columbus for a work dinner, about being told over and over in 100 small ways that I was the strong one, which had never once meant I was valued. It had only ever meant I was convenient. I told them I loved my father, and that his diagnosis broke my heart, genuinely, and that I would help but on my own terms, terms I would set, not terms handed to me at a dinner table in front of an audience clapping before I'd said a single word. And then I laid out exactly what that help would look like. I told them I would pay for professional in-home care, 3 mornings a week, out of my own pocket, from money I had earned with my own 2 hands, in a life they knew nothing about. I told them I would visit twice a year. I told them I would call every Sunday, as a guest in whatever remained of this family, not as a resource to be deployed whenever the family's math required it. And then I said the line that I think, if you asked anyone who was in that room, they would tell you is the one they remember most clearly. The one that actually shifted the temperature of the entire room. "And nobody," I said, looking directly at my mother, "makes an announcement about my life again without my consent. Not tonight. Not ever again." My mother's face went through about 4 different expressions in the space of 2 seconds, and the one it landed on was fury. "If you walk out that door," she said, her voice shaking, "don't bother coming back." I want you to notice something about that sentence, because I certainly did, standing there. It's the exact same architecture as Strong Kids Don't Make a Fuss. It's not a statement of fact. It's a threat disguised as a boundary and then designed to make the person leaving feel like the one burning the bridge, when the bridge had actually been built out of kindling from the very beginning. I picked up my coat. "Okay," I said. And I left. Linda met me in the driveway. She'd slipped out a few minutes after me, having stayed just long enough to grip my mother's hand once, hard, and say something to her I never fully found out the content of, though I have my guesses, and we were most of the way to the car when my father came out onto the porch after us, moving slowly, carefully, the tremor in his hand visible even from a distance in the porch light. He caught up to us at the car and handed me a folded piece of paper. He didn't say much. He wasn't a man who'd ever said much, honestly, even before the diagnosis. My mother had always been the one who did the talking in that marriage, the one who set the tone, and my father had mostly existed in her orbit, agreeing or staying quiet, and I think that's its own kind of failure, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself but does just as much damage over enough years. "Read it later," he said. "Not now." I read it in the motel room that night, sitting on the edge of the bed while Linda pretended to be asleep in the other bed to give me privacy, though I could tell by her breathing she wasn't. The note was short. My father wrote that a year after I left, he had hired a private investigator, on his own, without telling my mother at first. The investigator had come back with nothing. I'd been careful, and 4 years is a long time, and small towns in Idaho don't exactly advertise themselves to strangers asking questions. But the note said something else too, something that made me sit very still on that motel bed for a long time. He wrote that when he told my mother about the investigator, expecting her to be relieved or worried or something, she told him to stop looking. Her exact words, according to my father's note, were, "She'll come back when she needs us." I sat with that sentence for a long time. She'll come back when she needs us. Not when we need her. Not when we miss her. When she needs us. My mother's entire understanding of our relationship, laid bare in 5 words she said to her own husband, was transactional to its core. I wasn't a daughter to be found and loved back into the family. I was a resource that would eventually resurface on its own once its circumstances required drawing on the account. And the cruel, almost unbearable irony of it, the detail that still catches in my throat a little even now, is that she was almost right, just backwards. I didn't come back because I needed them. They came and found me because they needed me. The whole prediction was true, just aimed at the wrong person, and I don't think my mother has ever once to this day noticed that. That was almost a year before the day I'm telling you this story from now. I want to tell you what the year since has actually looked like, because I think that's the part people lean forward for the most, the part where you finally get to see whether any of it actually changed, or whether it was just one dramatic Thanksgiving that everybody quietly forgot about by Christmas. It didn't get forgotten about. That's the honest answer. The home care nurse started within 2 weeks of Thanksgiving. I arranged it myself, over the phone from Idaho, working with a home health agency near my parents' house, paying the invoice directly out of my own account every month without involving my mother at all, because I'd meant what I said about the terms being mine. My father has a nurse named Diane, a different Diane than the cousin who found the magazine article. Small towns and small families both being full of repeated names, who comes 3 mornings a week. And from what my father tells me, she's kind and patient and doesn't rush him, and he started slowly to look forward to Wednesdays and Fridays, because that's when she brings her dog. A scruffy old beagle he's apparently gotten unreasonably attached to. My father and I talk on Sundays now, like I said we would. It's not always an easy conversation. We're 2 people relearning how to talk to each other after essentially having no real relationship for most of my life, since he mostly stayed in my mother's shadow growing up. But it's real, and it's ours, and he started sending me photos. Bad photos. The kind an older man with an early tremor takes on a flip phone he refuses to upgrade. Blurry shots of his garden or a bird at the feeder, or once, memorably, an extremely close-up and unflattering picture of his own thumb that he apparently meant to be a sunset. I laugh every time. I think, in his own limited and quiet way, he's trying, and I've decided to let that count for something, because I think effort, real, awkward, imperfect effort, deserves a different response than the effort my mother never made. My mother and I have not spoken since that night in the driveway. Not once. Not by phone. The only communication I've had from her in the year since is a Christmas card. Store-bought, signed with just her name. No message inside beyond the printed greeting. I keep it. I'm not entirely sure why. I think some part of me is still waiting, and I've made peace with that part of myself rather than trying to shame it into silence. Waiting isn't the same as depending, and I've learned the difference the hard way. Rosa. Meanwhile, I have to tell you about Rosa's part in all of this, because it's one of my favorite details in the whole story. When she found out gradually, over the months after that Thanksgiving, the full shape of what my childhood had actually been, I'd told her pieces over the years, but never the whole thing. Until then, she didn't say much at first. She just went quiet for a few days, the way she does when she's thinking hard about something. And then one afternoon she sat me down with the paperwork for the cafe sale, the seller financing agreement we'd drawn up months earlier, and she told me she was lowering the remaining balance. Not because she felt sorry for me, she was very firm about that part, almost stern about it, but because, in her words, "You've more than earned it, and I'd rather you own this outright a year sooner than owe anybody anything a day longer than you have to." The sign outside the cafe changed not long after. It used to say, "Lakeshore Cafe, established 1994, Rosa Delgado, proprietor." Now it reads the same thing, except the last line says M. Sellers, proprietor, and every single time I walk past that sign in the morning before I unlock the door, some small, stubborn, 9 summers old part of me still can't quite believe it's real. And then there's Danny. About 4 months after that Thanksgiving, my brother showed up at the cafe. Alone at first, and then on a second visit a few weeks later, with his daughter, his 6-year-old, a bright, chatty, utterly fearless kid named after nobody in particular who took one look at the pastry case, one bite of a slice of pie, and declared, completely unprompted and with total conviction, that I was now to be known as Aunt Pie, not Aunt Myra. Aunt Pie. It stuck. Danny calls me that now too, half joking, though I can tell some part of him means it sincerely, means it as an apology dressed up as a nickname. Because that's the other thing Danny did, on that first visit. The one without his daughter. He asked me, quietly, sitting at the corner table where my mother had once told me I was what I'd left my family for, whether I still had the postcards. I did. I'd brought them with me in the blue suitcase 4 years earlier, and they'd traveled with me through every apartment since, and I went and got them from the back room and set all 9 of them on the table between us. Danny read the front's first 9 years of our mother's cheerful cursive, "Wish you were here," over and over, from Orlando and Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon and San Diego and Niagara Falls. And then, because I told him to, he turned them over and read the backs. At the small notes I'd started writing to myself starting around age 12, the true version underneath the performed one. Little true things. Linda taught me to fold dough today. I think I finally get it. Missed you at the lake, but the bakery smelled like cinnamon all week, not the worst trade. Nobody asked if I wanted to come this year. Nobody ever does. I'm starting to stop hoping they will. Danny didn't say anything for a long time after he finished reading them. And then he told me he'd known about the postcards the whole time he'd seen them arrive every summer, had even, once or twice as a teenager, considered turning one over himself, out of some flicker of curiosity, and had never done it. He apologized, not for the vacations exactly, not for something he'd had no real control over as a kid, but for that specific choice, the not turning over. The years of simply not looking too closely at a system that had always benefited him. Because looking closely might have required him to say something, and saying something might have cost him the version of family life that had always worked fine from where he stood. I appreciated that apology more than almost anything else that's happened in the year since. Not because it undid anything, and it didn't, it couldn't, but because it was specific. It wasn't a general, hazy, "I'm sorry things were hard for you." It was an apology for one particular choice, at one particular age, that he could actually name and own. And I think that specificity is the difference between an apology that means something and one that's just noise dressed up as remorse. This next Thanksgiving, the one that's coming up in a few weeks now actually, as I'm telling you, this is going to be at the cafe. My decision, my invitation, my table. Rosa will be there obviously, and Linda's flying in, and I've told the staff they're welcome. And I've told a handful of regulars too, the ones I know don't have anywhere better to be, because if there's one thing 9 years of being sent away taught me, it's that a table with an empty chair for anyone who needs one matters more than a table that only has room for people who already belong. Danny's coming, with Kelly and the kids. My father's coming too, with his nurse Diane driving him, since the trip's a little much for him alone these days. My mother has not been invited, and I want to be honest with you about how that decision sits in me, because I don't think it sits as anger anymore. Not really. It sits more like a closed door that I built myself, on purpose, with my own hands, the same hands that built everything else in this life. And I get to decide when or whether that door opens again, and on what terms. And I'm no longer interested in being the one who has to justify the terms to anyone but myself. I have one more thing to tell you, and it's the detail I think about most, out of everything in this whole story, because it's the one that finally made all 9 of those postcards mean something other than grief. A few weeks ago, before this Thanksgiving I've been telling you about, Linda came out to visit me early, just the 2 of us, the way it used to be back when Torch Bay was the only place in the world where I felt like a person instead of an arrangement. We sat at the same corner table where Danny had read the postcards, and I gave her one. Not one of the original 9. Those are mine. They're staying in the drawer where I keep them now, in my own house, my own terms. This was a new one. A postcard I'd bought at the little shop down by the marina. A photo of Lake Coeur d'Alene at sunset on the front, mountains going purple at the edges. And on the back, in my own handwriting, I wrote the same 4 words my mother had written to me 9 summers in a row. Wish you were here. Except this time, I handed it to her while she was sitting right across from me. This time, the person the postcard was addressed to was already in the room. This time, the words weren't a performance mailed from somewhere far away to someone being kept at a careful, convenient distance. They were true, and they were being said to a woman's face, and there was no suitcase involved at all. Linda cried. I did too a little, though I'll deny it if you ask her. The blue suitcase, by the way, the one that was zipped shut before I finished a sentence when I was 10, the one I packed myself at 18 and drove 2,000 miles with it, lives in the back closet of my house now, up above the lake. It doesn't hold clothes anymore. It holds holiday tablecloths. The good ones I only bring out a few times a year, folded neatly, waiting for a table that finally has room for everyone who's supposed to be sitting at it. I used to think being called the strong one was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and for a long time I think it genuinely was. But I've come to understand something in the years since I left that kitchen table in Ohio with a 4-sentence note and a suitcase I packed myself. And it's the thing I most want you to walk away with, if you take anything at all from everything I've just told you. Nav, being strong should never have to mean being the one who gets left behind. Love that requires you to disappear so somebody else's life has more room in it was never love to begin with. It was just an arrangement wearing love's clothes. And real family, the kind that's actually worth the name, and it doesn't wait for you to prove you're needed before it makes space for you. It just makes the space. It sets the extra plate before you even walk through the door. Not because it has to, but because that's what a table is for. I spent 9 summers waiting to be invited somewhere I already belonged. I'm not waiting anymore. I built the table myself. And this year, for the first time in my whole life, I get to be the one who decides who sits at it. And for the first time in my whole life, that decision feels less like a wound and more like the truest, quietest kind of home.